Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Unity of Claremont Sunday lesson for September the 13th, 2020. We are going to be studying for a few weeks The Eye of the Storm by Dr. Gary Simmons. The title of the first chapter is No One is Against You. Okay, right there, he has my attention. What a ridiculous statement. And in the first chapter, he begins to explain what he means by giving an example from his own life. And I encourage you to get the book and read that wonderful example. However, I hope you will indulge me as I give you an example from my own life. For one of my 3 years in law school, I had a job as the night counselor at a battered woman's shelter. At all hours of the night, law enforcement officers would bring battered women with a suitcase and their children in tow. They had been traumatized, their world turned inside out and upside down. Often they were still bleeding through their bandages. It was my job to get a certain amount of paperwork filled out before supplying them with soap, towels, or diapers and other necessities and taking them to their cottage, which they often had to share with one or even two other women and their kids. The shelter had various funding sources, and every funding source had different requirements. One source required that every woman commit to specific goals for becoming independent, like getting a job or getting an apartment. Other funding sources wanted the ethnicity, the date of birth, the Social Security number, not only of the mother, but for each of her children. If the paperwork required by a particular source was not done, the shelter would not be reimbursed by that source. Because so many women left the shelter after only one night, the manager of the shelter decided that all these various forms would have to be completed as soon as the women arrived. I quickly learned that getting all this information from women who were in shock while their children were crying, their injuries were aching, that was just cruel. That was just heaping administrative indignities on top of all the trauma that they had just experienced. So I solved this problem by getting just the bare minimum of information from each new arrival, having them sign mostly blank forms, and then I would get them settled in with their kids and put their kids to bed as quickly as possible. Then I would go back to my office and fill out the forms myself with totally fabricated information. I just made up Social Security numbers, dates of birth, employment goals, housing goals, relationship goals, everything. I just filled in the form with something that looked good. The funding sources would get their paperwork, the shelter would get its reimbursement, and the women suffered less than if the inhumane rules had been followed to the letter. So I figured it was win-win all around. Of course, I could have been fired, but no one ever questioned the paperwork, and I'm a little bit proud to say that the paperwork looked really authentic. After all, I was a law school student. But that's just an aside to the point I really want to make about what I learned at the women's shelter. I learned a lot about human nature in my year working with these battered ladies. For instance, when I informed the ladies that they would be sharing their cottage with one or two other families, sometimes a lady would ask if there was a locker or a safe where valuables could be kept. No, I had to tell them. We did not have lockers or safes, just basic temporary food and shelter. It was then that I learned that very often the ladies who were concerned about someone stealing their belongings were, to put it bluntly, they were just thieves themselves. Whenever a theft was reported, it often turned out that the ladies who had expressed fears that their things would be stolen were the very ones who were stealing from other families. The psychological name for this fact of life is projection. Dishonest people believe that, as a rule, most people are dishonest, and honest people think that, as a general rule, most people are honest. We all tend to be our own movie projector, not seeing the world as it is, but seeing our own inner world projected onto the screen of life. Our view of the world is distorted by the lens we are looking through, our own unique personality lens that has been created by a combination of inborn tendencies, education, and past experiences. There's a beautiful poem in A Course in Miracles. I am not a body, I am free, for I am still as God created me. If I think I'm just a body, then I think everybody else is just a body. And if I think my life is meaningless, then I think the whole world is meaningless. Put another way, nothing has meaning unless we give it meaning. We give meaning to everything we experience. A coffee mug is just a tool to carry stuff around, liquid or solid, coffee or pencils. But if it has a message printed on the outside that says "Number One Minister," and if, for instance, that mug might be given to me on October the 31st, 2020, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Unity of Claremont, or for my birthday on February the 10th, 2021, when I turn 75, it will have great meaning to me. If it someday winds up on the shelf at a Goodwill store, along with a wide assortment of mismatched dishes, it will have no meaning to anyone. It will just be another mug for coffee or pencils. It only has the meaning that I give it. And that's true of every aspect of your life. Everything that you fear to lose is meaningless in itself. You fear losing it because you have given it meaning. Everything that angers you, everything that you're happy about, is meaningless in itself. Here's a quote from Dr. Simmons. I make my life mean what it means. The way I choose to relate to my experience is what my experience becomes. The quality of my life, its ambiance, arises from within me. The eye of the storm is about putting the lens, the projector lens, aside and just turning off the movie projector and being at peace with what is, whatever it is. The common familiar phrase, the eye of the storm, is transformed by Gary Simmons into the first person singular pronoun I, that is the peaceful center of your being, the Christ within. This is the secret to understanding many of Jesus' sayings, which seem to be at odds with common sense. We've all heard Jesus quoted all our lives. I've even seen Jesus quoted when the writer obviously did not know who he was quoting. Even if you were not raised in a Christian environment, you have heard these famous sayings many times. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Judge not, lest you be judged. But the first century Jews who heard these words for the first time, directly from Jesus' lips, recognized them for what they actually are. They are shocking. They make no sense. Jesus' audience had been raised on the Ten Commandments, which do make sense. They make perfect sense, both then and now. Because theft, murder, adultery, giving false testimony under oath, or practicing foreign religions would undermine the stability of the Hebrew nation. In fact, they had been taught that Israel, at that time suffering under Roman rule, had been conquered by foreign empires precisely because they had failed to keep these basic, fundamental, and totally logical commandments. It all made perfect sense to them. But Jesus, unlike other prophets, did not chastise them for failing to keep the common sense commandments given them by Moses. Jesus was teaching something entirely different, something seemingly incomprehensible then as now. In the first century, Jesus said, "Don't put new wine into an old wineskin, because the old wineskin will break." He was telling them that they needed a new perspective, a new paradigm, because common sense cannot compute spiritual truth. The old wineskin of common sense simply cannot hold the teachings of spirit. And today, 2,000 years later, in A Course in Miracles, Jesus puts it very succinctly. Choose to see things differently. Jesus' teaching then and now is that you can put your lens aside and see things differently. You can stop projecting. You can be pure of heart. You can be a peacemaker. You can be your true self, a child of God, perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. Storms are experienced all over the planet. And in Florida, we are subject to the very worst kind of storm, the hurricane. Certain common elements form a hurricane. The cool air in the upper atmosphere contends with the warm, moist air from the ocean, and a current forms. The current shifts from horizontal to vertical and swirls around like a giant tornado. In the center of the storm, called the eye, because of the way the storm looks from a satellite, there is an amazing stillness. No wind, no rain, the sun comes out. There are also contending elements that make up a personal storm, the storms of your own experience. They are the strong currents of wants and needs, values and misperceptions, the need to be right, and defensiveness. In the Gospels, there's the wonderful story of Jesus and his disciples crossing the Sea of Galilee, probably in one of the disciples' own fishing boats, when a storm suddenly engulfed them. The boat was tossed so violently on the waves that the disciples, most of whom were fishermen with lots of experience in choppy waters, became alarmed. They feared that the boat would sink and they would all drown. Jesus amazingly was sleeping through the whole thing. They had to wake him up. They shouted at him, "How can you sleep through this? We are about to perish." Jesus asked them how they could have so little faith. Had they not learned anything as his disciples? He then calmly rose, and as it is phrased by the gospel writer, he rebuked the storm. "Peace," he commanded, "be still." And the storm immediately stopped. The winds died down, and the sun came out. In the case of our own personal storms, the I is the I of the great I am, your true self, the Christ of your being. There is no conflict in the Christ of your being. If you are experiencing a storm, you are not in your center. You have projected yourself out into the chaos of conflict. The Eye of the Storm by Gary Simmons has become a staple of the New Thought movement because it leads us in very simple language, step by step, to see things as Jesus saw them. Every element of your personal storms is explained, and the means to neutralize inner conflicts is also explained. A customary greeting in our culture is, "Hi, how are you doing?" Or just, "Hi, how are you?" And the customary response is, "Fine, and you?" Nobody expects and nobody really wants to hear a litany of troubles. Well, since you asked, I have a slight headache, my husband never takes out the garbage, my boss doesn't know how to speak to me without a sarcastic put down, and my dog has forgotten her house training. But other than that, I'm fine. Just peachy. Well, I'm not suggesting that you do that. So unless you're having a heart attack or your house is on fire, if someone asks you, "How are you doing?" go ahead and just say, "Fine. How are you doing?" But I am suggesting that you do not do that within your own mind, within your own thinking. It's unfortunate that we are taught not to feel our feelings or acknowledge our emotions. We just keep telling ourselves we are fine, when, if we actually look within, we may find that we are not fine. Perhaps you were taught that feeling your feelings was a sign of weakness or lack of character. I'm not mad at my husband, my wife, my mother, my father, my son, my daughter, just fill in the blank. Good people don't get angry at the people they love, and I'm a good person. I'm fine. I'm not afraid of my co-workers' opinions. I have too much self-esteem to let their gossip upset me. I'm fine. The eye of the storm teaches us how to both recognize and face our storms and calmly command, "Peace, be still." And lo and behold, the light will dawn. I really want to get to that place, don't you? I want to come from my calm center, the I am, instead of from the chaos of 150-mile-per-hour fear and anger. I want to know I'm in control of the quality of my life. I want the Christ of my being to give meaning to my experiences. So I invite you to go with me on this journey that Dr. Simmons has mapped out for us. As practical application, I invite you to join me this week in listing the storms of our lives. At the end of each day, list the big things and the little things, everything that disturbs the calm peace of your soul. Some examples of the kind of storms we all experience are, well, there are physical storms, from the irritation of an ingrown toenail to the panic of a cancer diagnosis. There are financial storms, from the stress of an unexpected car repair to anguish over the loss of a job. There are relationship storms, from the hurt of an unkind word to the devastation of a complete betrayal. Spiritual storms can take the form of nagging guilt over a missed meditation or the utter blackness of the dark night of the soul. I'm not asking you to analyze or diagnose the cause of your storms. Just list them, just write them down. Just acknowledge them, because that is the first step. The forces in our storms need to be seen. They need to be acknowledged so that we can heal. We need to heal before we can release. Acknowledge, heal, release. That's the process. So every day for a week, if you're not completely at peace, simply write down whatever comes to your mind as your immediate experience. Remember, whenever you're not at peace, you're having a storm. Now I invite you to get centered, and please join me in this closing affirmation. I'm not a body, I am free, for I am still as God created me. Amen. So be it, and so it is. So just as a reminder, I hope that, as always, you are invited to join us every Wednesday at 7 p.m. for a half-hour meditation with our wonderful crystal singing bowls. So until we meet again, this is Nancy Willingham wishing you a wonderful week.